Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on partition of India in print media and cinema. So, today we are going to talk about the accounts of the survivor. We have already discussed in detail about rehabilitation and the process of recovery, the recovery operations that were carried out on both sides of the border and how the women were affected as a result of this. So, today we are going to take a look at some of the fictions, and not necessarily about the woman, but about the different voices, secondary voices. So, today we are going to look at the, for example, the perspective of the child, and of course, then we are going to talk about the experience of the woman that has been abducted and returned. So, today we are going to talk about the experiences of the non-male members of the new post-colonial nations and what they underwent as a result of the atrocities that led to and followed the partition. So, we see that this ideology behind the recovery operation was not only to bring the abducted women back to their natal home, but also bring them within the fold of a patriarchal structure. So, women were returned to their male members, and women that were not supported by male members were seen, they were perceived as potential threats that were destabilizing the normalcy of the ones they were destabilizing the moral values that a society holds as very dear. So, we see that women were returned to their male members. That is something at the heart of the recovery operation. And so, Stephen Morton says, and I just read what he says, although the recovery process might seem like a worthy cause that counteracts the abduction and violation of women, it is also complicit in the maintenance of national boundaries and discourses of ethnic purity. So, in the same way, Shumona Dasgupta goes on to say that partition was coded as a failure of the male nationalist to protect the political integrity of the nation, as well as the inability of Hindu and Sikh men to protect their women. This led to a violent compensatory performance of masculinity. So, the recovery operation, the recovery act becomes a display of this welfarist paternalistic attitude of on the part of the male enactors the male enactors that were at the forefront of this nation building process. They were helpless at a point when they were not able to save the women, salvage the women from the fate, the violence that the women encountered, and so as a compensatory act later try to accommodate these women within the disciplinary fold, within the disciplinary parameters of a new nationalist discourse. But as the feminist critics note, this bringing back is also another process of violence. It is not something that happens often with the consent and consultation with the woman, right. So, previous day we were in the previous lecture we were talking about the rioters and how Mohanalakshmi Rajkumar observes their helpless position in not being able in an earlier instance they have not been able to protect the dignity of a woman from their own community. As a result, they display hypermasculinity through violating another woman from the opposite community. That is the gesture of retaliation, the gesture of getting back actually tends to hide the vulnerability the helplessness of the males. A mob is essentially, as Rajkumar argues, a mob is essentially a sign of helplessness. The gesture of a mob is something that reflects failure of the patriarchal project of nation and nationalism. So, something that went wrong, and so the violence is etched on the woman's body. Now, violence on women and the process of recovery, as we have been stating again and again, the entire process was horrendous, and these horrific incidents have been depicted in so many literary works, so many artworks that are available in different languages. So, for example, in Saadat Hasan Manto's Khol Do, we see that the perpetrators are, the beauty of Manto's writing lies in not attaching any communal identification with the perpetrator. So, the perpetrator is not seen as a Hindu or a Muslim, a Hindustani or a Pakistani. These are just insane human beings that they have gone on a killing spree, they are committing heinous acts, carnage, and so they are depicted as human beings with all their insanity and barbarity. Today we are mainly going to talk about Manto's Khol Do, along with referring to a couple of more stories by Manto, and then we are going to discuss in details another important work called Lajwanti. Lajwanti is a short story by Rajinder Singh Bedi, and it explores the plight of the abducted woman during the upheavals that one witnessed at the time of 1947 partition. So, the stark emotional, we could call it as the emotional scape, the skewed mental scape that prevailed at the time of partition, and so women faced the brunt of such violence. So, I mean, when we talk of Manto's short stories, at the heart of his works, and that informs most of his writings, which is brevity and a shocking effect, something that jolts the reader out of his or her callous location outside of the time space of the stories. We are not allowed to remain passive consumers of violence. We are made to think, and so it disturbs, and the stories by Manto basically destabilizes and disquiets the reader. So, to read the English translation of Manto's short story, that is titled as Jelly, would go as follows. So, at 6 in the morning, the man who used to sell ice from a push cart next to the service station was stabbed to death. His body lay on the road, while water kept falling on it in steady driblets from the melting ice. At 7:15, the police took him away. The ice and blood stayed on the road. A mother and a child rode past the spot in a tonga. The child noticed the coagulated blood on the road, tugged at his mother's sleeve and said, "Look, mummy, jelly." And that is where the story stops. The story is as brief as just comprising one paragraph, and it is sharp, it is incisive, it hits the reader directly. It actually covers only the time span that it takes for blood to coagulate and take the shape of jelly. So, Jelly actually talks about the child's misinformed perception. The child that is still innocent and does not know about the reasons that that cause a riot, the reason that causes human killings and the atrocities, the carnage, understands, perceives a blood clot on the road as jelly. He does not understand that a murdered person has been an individual that has been murdered. I mean, it's the blood of a person that has been assassinated. There is a kind of mortal perversity in this singular manifestation. So, we see an interplay of emotions in this story comprising only a few lines. On the one hand, we have the child's joy, ecstasy, which is a misinformed ecstasy, by the way, in seeing the jelly, seeing the blood that he fathoms as jelly on the road. And then we have the mother, who is an adult onlooker of the partition happenings, and who has all the idea, I mean, who has some idea of what is lying on the road. And the mother must be terrified, she must be petrified at the child's suggestion. So, we see how there is an interplay of different contrastive emotions in the story. The child's joy versus the mother's fear and apprehension. So, the spectatorship and responsibility of this gruesome deed have been carried on to the level of juvenile sensitivity, but in a displaced fashion. It has gone on to it is not even leaving the child aside. It has even the child has become a spectator to the whole thing, but they understand it differently. So, this joyful misconception by the child and the child's different perspective. How does the child experience partition? A child onlooker seeing blood on the road while traveling in a tonga, it amplifies the macabrous vision, right. So, partition scholars have observed time and again that women and children were rendered a secondary status vis-a-vis the nationalist discourse, and they were rendered an infantile status by the rehabilitation measures, for example, that were undertaken by the paternalistic state. So, Manto here is incorporating the other's perspective, which unnerves, basically which goes on to disquiet the complacence that is associated with the grand narrative on the independence of both the nations, abutting nations. Similarly, we have another short stories. There are very many short stories that could be discussed, but due to lack of time and scope, we have brought here only select short stories by Manto. Another would be a short story called Modesty, and we observe the great paradox of human character. It is at the time of the riots. This is how the story goes, and it is as brief as this. So, the rioters brought the train to a stop. Those who belonged to the other religion were methodically picked out and slaughtered. After it was all over, those who remained were treated to a feast of milk, custard pies and fresh fruit. Unquote. So, this is the entire story, only 3 or 4 lines. So, we see how human mind works on the warped manner of thinking that informs the writer's mind. So, on the one hand, they are conferring food and geniality, and they are congratulating a set of people that belong to the same community, and on the other, the same people are methodically, systematically killing, decimating the peoples that are perceived as outside of the community. So, this goes on to tell us about the difference, how a nation state is formed on the edifice of this difference between the citizen, our own people, versus the outsider, someone who does not belong. So, such an idea nation thereby delegitimizes any possibility of plural existence, plural communities, syncretic communities, and so such a nation formation of the heart of such nation and nationalities concept is the idea of pure political nations. We are talking in terms of purity, and so anything that is outside, perceived as outside or kind of diluting, threatening the purity of the nation is decimated, it is gotten rid of, it is eradicated. So, train becomes in essence the twin post partition nations. So, we have the act of feasting going on, and it is almost, I mean, it's unseemly and it's so inhuman that people are feasting. There is excess of blood on the one hand, bloodbath, and on the other hand people are feasting, there is a party, there is a funfair going on. So, onerous celebration of a supposed independence, and this notion of independence where feasting has to go on simultaneously with bloodbath is being imposed on the common people. It is extremely fulsome, it is repugnant after a point, and that is something that Manto is trying to depict in the short story. So, coming to his short story Khol Do, it challenges the discourse of nationalism and problematizes such an idea through depicting how the idea of nationalism is co-opted with patriarchal ideology. So, nationalism and patriarchy actually go hand in hand. Nationalism upholds and in turn is upholded by the patriarchal setup, the patriarchal mechanism, and so both together habit in there is a connivance between these two concepts in further and further marginalizing the woman. So, it is done through a set of fine tuned techniques of microphysics of power, as Michel Foucault would suggest, and so they are very similar in the way they operate, in the way they function, the idea of nationalism and the idea of patriarchy. The story begins with Sirajuddin witnessing the violence and chaos around him, and he remembers how his wife had already died due to this aggression. Completely absorbed by his thoughts, Sirajuddin's hand reaches the dupatta of his daughter Sakina and suddenly recognizes that the daughter is missing. The old father gets up and starts asking people about his daughter, and finally, there are some young men that claim to be volunteers and who promise to help the desperate father. And then some time has passed, some time elapses. In another scene, we see these same men traveling in a lorry with a missing young woman, a missing young girl without her dupatta actually, and who is trying to cover her bosom with her hands. So, this, and after that the reader is taken to the final scene, the climax of the story, which is in a refugee camp where a woman, a half dead young girl is brought for medical checkup. Sirajuddin comes and recognizes the body of this young woman, half dead woman, as his daughter, and upon reaching the hospital, he enters the doctor's room where the body has been placed, and the doctor looks at the body on the stretcher and commands to open the window. The doctor says open it, suggesting that the windows be opened so he can take a better look and examine the patient properly. Upon hearing these words, Sirajuddin's daughter Sakina actually moves faintly, She, with her almost dead hands, she undoes a salwar and lowers it. So, the reaction of the father is remarkable. He is joyous. He cries, with happiness that Sakina, she is alive, my daughter is alive. And the doctor in turn is drenched in sweat. That is where the story actually ends. So, Sakina becomes representative of a great number of women whose bodies were receptacle of the atrocities committed during this tumultuous time period. So, these women bore the brunt of the chaos of partition, and their chapters have been silenced and forgotten from history. So, this silenced part of history is being given voice through Sakina's singular gesture of untying her pajama strings. So, Sakina is a victim of different fragments of power that have been exercised on her, and all of them have oppressed and dehumanized her. So, Khol Do explores how the women that were migrating to their respective countries were violated and victimized not only by men from the opposite communities, but conversely also by the ones that claimed to be volunteers and that came garbed as the protectors, the supposed protectors. So, in the story we see that Sakina is a Muslim girl. She is ravished by the Hindu or Sikh men, and then later on in the process of being salvaged, being brought back, she is also ravished by the men from her own community. So, from here we get a very skewed notion of nationalism, where the protector becomes the predator in fact, and where this collective madness and lack of humanity spares no one. And this is something that Manto is trying to examine. Manto presents how men wanted, who were considered as rescuers of national honor and pride through protecting and safeguarding the woman, were the ones that had resorted to bestiality and madness. So, Tarun Saint commends Manto's work for dealing with anxiety of representation that surrounded the grey zone of the partition. So, we see that there is only a thin line separating the victim from the perpetrator. So, the man, once again going back to the image of the or the symbol of the mob, the one that has been victimized before, the male victim at a later stage goes on to become the male aggressor, and the line between sanity and insanity is very thin and almost fragmented, breaking down. So, the complete effacement of any kind of moral structure created a situation of utter panic and chaos, and it further exacerbated the ongoing rioting. So, Khol Do is challenging the any form of linear narrative on interfaith or enmity. And this is something, this is a common a stock narrative or assumption that historiography is based on. This is a stock assumption that Hindus were against the Muslims, Sikhs were against the Muslims, and vice versa. So, here we see that the young girl is violated by men from all communities actually, and this harkens back the lecture that where we earlier discussed about how the police, the people from the upper echelons of the society, men in power, I mean people from influential factions were all conniving, they were all in a way they were supporting one another. They were in the process of trading of women, selling women as slave girls, and so it is very difficult to understand who is the protector and who is the violator. And so, by questioning the institution of social work here, I mean what the volunteers are actually doing in the story, we understand how, by questioning the institution of social work, here the project of nationalism, the project of welfare and charitable acts, by the volunteers is being questioned. So, the idea of social work, the idea of volunteers or national heroes rescuing the victims is put to question. So, Manto depicts the futility of nationalist ideology on both sides of the border, and he notes that such an ideology is standing, it is founded on ideas of hypermasculinity. So, patriarchal ideology acts as a form of a regulatory power that dehumanizes women, no matter what their nationality or religion, right. And so, they are expected to be made submissive to the prevalent patriarchal ideology. So, in Khol Do, body and language both function as simulacra in which collective desire and collective death overlap. The body of Sakina, actually it is a concentrate of collective desire, and as the author suggests, the body has died many times, although it is not medically declared as dead. So, through economization of words, Manto is unfolding trauma in its glaring intensity, something that had balked and rendered defunct the smooth programming of articulation. It had, we see that the slippage in meaning, the relation between the signifying word and its concomitant silent gesture is kind of distorted. So, there is a slippage in meaning through a distorted relationship between the signifying word and the concomitant silent gesture. So, in Sakina's act there is a mechanical responding quality, and it is unveiling the libidinous components of massacre. So, we see emotion and language being juxtaposed with action, where there are two elements being deployed by Manto. One is terseness, brevity, and then comic treatment of bloody acts, grisly sights, which enable a visualizing capacity in the reader and deliberately heightens an unguarded shocking impact, something that is unprecedented, something that the reader did not expect as coming, and so it is unglaring and hits the reader directly. So, beyond expressing her horrific violation, his utterance, the father significantly, Sirajuddin, father of Sakina, wants the daughter to live despite knowing that parts of her body have failed, and so he is embracing, he is accepting her mutilated self, the way he finds the daughter. So, Sirajuddin's accepting the suffering Sakina, who might have been considered as socially dead by other fathers, is actually remarkable in the story. And we understand the female body is going to carry this pain, even if Sakina survives. We do not know if she will survive, and if she does, she will carry this pain, this remembrance of violence in her body for the rest of her life. So, in Open It, we could see that there is, if we discuss, I mean, if we understand the story in terms of what violence does to language, we would note that there is a complete breakdown of the language system. So, there is a flabbergasted quality to the individual responding mechanism, and that actually reveals violence or reveals the bestial act in its bare form. So, the dark side of language emerges through a lack of comprehensibility. There is a gap and a lacuna that cannot be overcome, cannot be bridged. So, the maimed girl that has been the maimed girl that has encountered rape several times, she has been raped by many men, and so she is able to interpret all signifiers only in terms of that one signification that encompasses her distraught body. So, we see it is a historical moment that had warped the normal functioning of a message. Khol do, it could mean the word open it, or khol do could refer to so many things. In this instance, it was referring to a window, a command that window be opened, but Sakina relates it only with one signification of untying her pajama strings and lowering her shalwar. So, open it hints at the cataleptic act of opening and closing of limbs. She is opening the shalwar and then she is opening her limbs, doing and undoing of the pajama strings at the command of a succession of rapists. So, here Manto does not explain, he is giving us a very paired off form. There is a minimalism in his language, which actually captures the society's crisis and shame for losing the capacity of sane imagination. Who is to be blamed for Sakina's loss of sane imagination? Whenever she hears khol do or open it, she actually connects it with the very one thing, right? She can only connect it with one thing. So, we see this overwhelming presence of only one meaning at the cost of obfuscating other meanings, as in the case of open it. It refers to a situation where partition had become overarching, it had become larger than the condition of normal human existence. So, at this point I would like to stop today's lecture and let us meet for another round of discussions with the next lecture. Thank you.